And the first thing following from those last two shares, with those slides with the numbers on, hegemonic groups, where there's one dominant force, have just a completely different dynamic from a relatively evenly balanced group like Europe. Within Europe, there is this commitment for the history, but also because of the relative sizes of the major players, to create something new. It can't be France imprinting its image on everybody else. Think about signing a deal with the USA. The USA doesn't give much ground. I mean, you sign a deal and you do what the USA says, you come to look like the USA. Pretty much the same in SACU with South Africa, 90% of the output, and so on. So the dynamic of compromise or creating something new is really quite different. It's not a takeover, it's a sort of a genuine merger. Now, a lot of people argue when we look around the developing world, I'm afraid the European Commission sometimes argues like this, that you should be a bit more like us, you need to have some more institutions like us. I'm very unclear that that is viable. Very interesting bit of, I suppose, political science in the last 5 years, last year, by Douglas North, Wallace, and Barry Weingast, introducing this notion of the natural state, where essentially they recognize that states, the natural state, as opposed to the rather pleasant world that Europe and the North Americans have created, the natural state is basically a business of balancing between different bits of the elite. And if all of your politics, your rent-seeking, your whole process is about balancing different bits of the elite, you have to keep rebalancing. So put outside that some supranational power like the European Court or even the Commission is likely to make life very, very difficult. I'm not saying that sort of the intergovernmental stuff and what we see within Mercosur, within Africa, doesn't have influence from outside, but it is all fundamentally intergovernmental. It's not that the African Union decided to talk to whoever in Zimbabwe or in Kenya. It was that individual African governments decided we have to get involved in this because there's something at stake. So again, it wasn't a commission or it wasn't a court. So my guess is that the European institutions don't generalize very well. Since Ahmed has waved the flag at me, let me be very quick. The story about trade is, I think, fairly well known. There's a great deal of trade growth. Exactly as Luke said, quite a lot of that's because intra-trade, because Europe is large. We have intra-industry specialization. We have specialization increasing a little bit in Europe, but not very much. But the important thing when we look at this sort of response to the trade is it plainly owes much more, or it's due to much more than just tariff changes. It's deep integration. The Treaty of Rome wanted to create a common market. It didn't get all that far down that route. The Single Market Initiative took that process very much further by sort of what I've loosely called trade facilitation, improvements of harmonization, recognition of standards, transportation, procurement rules, and so on, so that we have moved quite a long way beyond just reducing tariff barriers towards making trade profitable and easy. The monetary union helps that. It's not necessary. But however you cut it, whenever you look at what's going on in Europe, this integration is incomplete. We don't have anything like the integration that you see in the United States, and that essentially is the remnants of the national borders. I think the messages about policy that we should take from that sort of process are exactly, as Andre had said, it's a continuing process. If it's stop and start, but it goes on more or less all the time. It's always possible to address the next problem, and so in some sense it's not held up by waiting for the perfect solution. It's far more than tariffs, and very, very important. Much of the best of European policy, much European policy has been pro-competitive, to build competitive markets within Europe. Competition policy, I mean, the single market and the euro, in a sense, are the big flag wavers for that, but there's competition policy. There was also a balance of payments chapter in the Treaty of Rome, just to say, look, the money, if you're going to integrate markets, money's got to flow easy from one place to another. We'll have no truck with restrictions on balance of payments flows. There is even, I would argue, a certain amount of common labour policy, not in the grand sense, but sort of tinkering around the details. There's another set of policies which also contain lessons, and that's what I've called here common policies, should have called common sectoral policies. Transport, coal and steel, of course, it started off with, and most importantly, we have energy, almost nothing has happened, and agriculture. These common policies in Europe grew up essentially because the national governments were already intervening in these sectors, and when they got together, that was going to create distortions, and so someone had to sort of get astride of that regulatory mess and sort of bring it all together. And the common policies, in a sense, did that. One of the lessons of that is it's easier to integrate if you're liberalizing because there are fewer things you're going to have to worry about, fewer places that the government has got to intervene. The common agricultural policy is a real object lesson to us all. It's a pretty bad policy. It is not about France and Germany not fighting each other. It's one tiny bit of that. The European enterprise is about that. It has, I think, made two very bad mistakes. First, the Treaty of Rome contains 7 clauses devoted to agricultural incomes. It's built in constitutionally. It also creates a dedicated bureaucracy whose single job is to make sure that agriculture survives and does well and goodness knows what. Those are 2 things that you need to avoid. I'm getting the eye now. Just let me jump to the bottom line. Europe is unique, but it has some lessons. It's instructional. And I think really the lessons are, it's much more than tariffs. You need pro-competitive policies. It probably is easier if you liberalize. History is what lies behind the European institutions. And whatever you do, don't envy the Europeans their history. All right? Those wars were awful. Awful even by the standard, particularly by the standards of today's wars. European integration grew out of the most monumental mess that we made out of Europe over 300 or 400 years. Don't replicate it. So by all means, developing countries need to think about the policies that Europe has sort of learned the lesson of, but they're going to need to find their own way of achieving them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. We have just heard 3 presentations. To me, they translate into the same thing. All of them are telling you about the process of integration, the motivation, the consequence, and so on and so forth. But essentially, it is converging. It's something admirable, something to learn from. I do hope our discussants are going to diverge from that. Otherwise, we'll be celebrating having one party after another forever. The next speaker is actually the first discussant, which is Mr. Anthony Urdal. Actually, I practiced that one before, and I still didn't get it exactly right. He is the Manager, Integration and Trade Sector, Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge, Inter-American Development Bank in the U.S. in Washington. It's a sister bank to the World Bank for the Latin American region. The floor is yours, sir. 15 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to the GDN for this invitation. Let me try to do this presentation very fast. I'll try to do 3 things. First, I'll just try to, in a couple of slides, summarize my understanding of the three papers. I think there's lots of commonalities on these 3 presentations. Second, I'll try to convince you that today's what's going on in the regional integration around the world is really a process of recalibrating. When we think about regional integration, it's a big process of redefinition. And in this context, the point that I will make is, I think, is the EU is even becoming less of a model than it was before. But that doesn't mean that we cannot take some specific lessons, and this will be my last part of the presentation. What are really specific lessons that one can learn from this experience? Just a couple of slides trying to summarize my reading, and it's something that I shared from the analysis of these 3 presentations. Really, the important part when one talks about the process of European integration is about the what and not the how it has been done. And I think this was a process that was stressed by André. I think when we think about integration, even in my region, in Latin America, or even in Asia, people think too much about the how, the process, the stages, and I think that André has made a very strong point about this.